and it is really so wonderful of you to think of organizing something like this. I feel greatly honored to be invited to give this lecture today as almost a farewell address as I leave Boston University School of Theology after 5 semesters of teaching as visiting professor of world Christianity. I'm extremely grateful to all of you, especially to our Dean, Mary Elizabeth Moore, for inviting me and nurturing me with her generosity and care. My wife Cecilia joins with me in thanking you all. She has chosen to be celebrating the arrival of our grandson in Atlanta rather than celebrating my departure from Boston. When I arrived here in 2011, all of you welcomed me and accepted me as one among you, even though I was only a visiting professor. In most places, visiting professors tend to remain invisible. But here in BU, we are incorporated so very well into the life of the school that I feel as if I have been teaching here for many years. I'm sure Dr. Peter Paris will agree with me. I want to thank all the students who took my classes, studied with me, and taught me along the way as well. I also thank you, all my colleagues, who shared a meal with me or engaged me in fruitful conversations. Thank you. The series of events that have been planned during last week and this week in honor of me clearly show your welcoming spirit and your generous hospitality. Thank you again. Please do not be fooled by the name of today's lecture, Legacy Lecture. Neither by the title, A Global Future. I'm simply reflecting right now on how I, as an Indian Christian theologian from India, have grown in my understanding of both theology and theological education, and also projecting myself imaginatively into the future and share my vision of what those may or should look like in the 21st century. This vision expresses only my dream, my longing, my hope for theology and theological education here and in India. Global, in my case, has been defined largely by India and the United States, with a touch of other countries here and there. And today my lecture is organized under 3 headings: developments in theology, changes in theological education, and a global future for these two. Developments in theology. In the year Paul Tillich died, in 1965, it almost sounds like in the year King Uzziah died. So in the year Paul Tillich died, my intentional and intensive involvement in theology began. As I was enrolled in the Bachelor of Divinity program, which is the same as Master of Divinity here, at Sarampur College in Sarampur, West Bengal, India. I had been brought up in and nurtured by Anglican piety, since my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather were all Anglican ministers in the Diocese of Tirunelveli. This form of piety was shaped by regular liturgical life, with the Eucharist at its center. However, in 1956, Billy Graham came to our part of India for the first time and held evangelistic crusade in our town. and the religious landscape of our diocese turned toward a form of evangelical piety. I myself was heavily influenced by that piety as I decided to enter the ministry of the church in a conversion event of accepting Christ as my personal Lord and Savior in 1961. The Bible and meditation on biblical passages was seen as the primary activity of a Christian. The seminary, of course, I also happened to read Stanley Jones's book on conversion, since my father had it in his library. The seminary where most of the pastors were trained was called Tamil Nadu Theological College, and here the word theological was translated as Veda Shastra, which means Shastra of the Vedas, study of the scriptures. That was the translation for theology at that time in my area. With this understanding of theology as study of scriptures, I went and entered theological education, and it was polytechnic, along with my other teachers, who opened my eyes to the journey that a theologian makes beyond the exegesis of the Bible. I gave a resounding yes to his definition of theology. St. Anselm's view of theology as faith seeking understanding confirmed this view of theology as well for me. Tillich wrote, a theological system is supposed to satisfy two basic needs: the statement of the truth of the Christian message and the interpretation of this truth for every new generation. Theology moves back and forth between two poles, the eternal truth of its foundation and the temporal situation in which the eternal truth must be received. With this view of theology, I ministered as a pastor, presbyter of the Church of South India in 1968. I saw my sermons as theological statements in the Tillichian sense. After a few years of parish ministry, I joined the faculty of Tamil Nadu Theological Seminary at this point in a different town, which was called Tamil Nadu Iraiyil Kalluri at Madurai in 1971. The word for theology has changed by now. It was not Veda Shastram, it was Iraiyil, which means study, a disciplined study of God. Yet I did not pay much attention to the new word Iraiyil, and went on to define theology in Tamil, Patturudin Samagala Sullakam, which means contemporary articulation in language and words of one's faith. That's how I define it. It uses the richest word for faith in my mother tongue and hints at the imaginative and constructive nature of theological task. The word Sollakam, which is language and words, limited theology to academic and discursive activity alone. Even though during this period I was writing a lot of hymns and setting them to Indian popular music. I even wrote a hymn on the task of theology. Interestingly, the hymn reflects my early fascination with the Bible and incorporate liberational thrust of the Christian gospel in the definition itself. As a student of Dr. Gordon Kaufman during the 80s, I learned that theology was a discipline whose proper object of study was not faith, nor the eternal message, but the image or concept of God, and that it was primarily an act of human imaginative construction, which Kaufman loved to repeat as many times as possible. This learning helped me to return to the Tamil word for theology, Iraial, disciplined study of God. Theology has everything to do with Irai, God. And it is real study, disciplined study. So I began to use the Kaufman's threefold scheme and started defining theology as a critical reflection on God, Irai, humanity, Manu, and world, Ulagu, in light of Jesus the Christ. Christuவின் கண்ணோட்டத்தில். It matched so well with what the Saivites, the Hindus in my area, were talking about God. They talked about God, soul, and bondage or world. So I thought I got it. Whether theology could be limited to discursive writing alone was a question that began to haunt me. As I worked with the idea of human imaginative construction, my involvement in writing hymns and setting them to music began to nudge me to consider poems, hymns, songs, music, painting, liturgy, and such other activities as proper theology. I find Brian Wren, the hymn writer, defining theology in a much more helpful way. He writes, Christian theology is done when anyone attempts by artistic skill and creativity the interplay of intellect and imagination and or the methods of reasoned inquiry to grasp, to know, to understand the meaning of God's creating, self-disclosing, liberating activity centered in Jesus Christ. Today, I define theology using three theses that I learned from Kaufman. You can put thesis. Thesis one. The proper task of theology is to analyze, criticize, and reconstruct the received or given ideas concerning God in terms of their adequacy, appropriateness, and relevance. Every time I define theology in the thesis, I also go to define what Christian theology is. So the first sentence is, the proper task of theology is to analyze, criticize, and reconstruct the received or given ideas concerning God in terms of their adequacy, appropriateness, and relevance. Christian theologians, however, carry out this task in light of the life, ministry, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus the Christ. Thesis 2. It is humans who, in the midst of their historical particularities, cultural peculiarities, and aesthetic distinctiveness, perform the task of theology. Therefore, theological formulations are always located, conditioned, multiple, and tentative. Christian theologians, furthermore, take the Christian faith community into account in the doing of their theology. Thesis 3. Theology, in its reconstructive task, engages in critical reflection on both the adoration of God and the action for human well-being. Christian theologians, however, engage in this task with the goal to enable their faith communities perform their public ministry with love and care. Even now, I use this threefold definition in my classes. Now, let me say a few words about theological education, tracing my journey as a theological educator before we go to imagine a future. I went into theological study imagining that theological education is ministerial training, especially for the ordained ministry of the church. My classmates in theology school were all going to be ministers in their respective churches. My work as a theological teacher also took the form of ministerial training. I worked with the commitment to train ministers, train educated ministers for our churches. But this was expanded by at least 3 developments in theological education. First, theology itself gained a broader function than how Tillich defined it. Theology as a function of the Christian church must serve the needs of the church. That's the opening sentence of systematic theology. But now theology began to be seen as having a public function. Soon, secondly, I began to have in my classes more and more students who were not pursuing ministerial vocation. This happened both in India and here. So my earlier thing has to change. Thirdly, one began to realize that it was important, perhaps even more important, to have not only educated clergy, but also informed laity. Several programs to promote lay theological education were created in the seminary I taught in India. Most of my hymns were written with lay theological education in mind. Still, I did not move away from ministerial training. Rather, I broadened and redefined my understanding of ministry. I was still training ministers. All my students are ministers out there in the world, serving people, communities, and societies in various ways. I am training them for that ministry. The vocation of a scholar was a significant part of this training, as I understood it. Yet, I was in the work of enabling and empowering not simply scholars, but scholarly ministers. My special focus was on how to train ministers for a world of many religions, such as Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, and so on. Students who were not in the ordination track and MTS students enrolled in my class, they were aware of this ministerial focus of mine, and they were willing to be put up with it. Now today I'm here training public theologians and public ministers for a bigger and wider world than one I have known in the past. A global future for theology and theological education. I invite you now to imagine with me a global future for theology and theological education. For the last 25 years, I have been trained by you and others to think globally as a professor of world Christianity. When I joined Candle, anytime anybody used the word world, everybody would look at me as if I was in charge of the world. Sometimes I even thought I was in charge of the globe. I used to introduce myself this way. I am the professor of world Christianity, of whom they sing he's got the whole world in his hands. And in the meantime, I have published several essays on theological education during these years of teaching as professor of world Christianity. In most of these essays, I have tried to imagine a global future as well. Let me not rehearse them all now. Neither do I want to do a survey of various writings, beginning with Edward Farley's work on theological education in 1988. These writings give us various clues as to how one may imagine the future. Anyhow, if you want to know the global state of theological education today, you may go to Handbook of Theological Education in World Christianity. Theological Perspectives, Regional Surveys, and Ecumenical Trends. edited by Werner, Esterlin, Kang, and Raja, which is available in our library. What I'm doing now is to imagine a global future for theology and theological education as I see it, and mention only some pointers to that global future. Number one, a challenge to instill global consciousness. I imagine a global future in which we respond continuously to a challenge to instill global consciousness in our own theology and in our theological education. In my address last week on living and working with world Christianity at the Center for Global Christianity, I dreamed of theology and theological education to be so instilled with global consciousness that there will be no need for professors of world Christianity anymore in the schools. I gave two reasons for such a dream. One, we will have such critical mass of international faculty in our schools teaching the traditional disciplines with their non-American perspectives that all our students will be exposed to global variety of approaches to and methods of theological education. Second, every discipline and every theological teacher would be so imbued with the spirit of world Christianity that there will be no need for a professor of world Christianity. After the address, Professor Dana Robert came up to me and said, Thomas, your dream can come true only in an ideal world. In the real world today, we still need professors of world Christianity and mission to nudge our colleagues and students to be globally conscious in their work. I agree with her. Till that great day arrives, let us have professors of world Christianity. But make sure that they teach the regular and required courses in their discipline with a world Christianity perspective. Our school did this by making one of my courses as fulfilling a systematic theology requirement in the curriculum. Whereas Emory, where I taught for 25 years, my courses remained as electives, and it was never recognized as courses in systematic theology. I think within our given settings, we can find new ways to instill global consciousness in our theology and theological education. For example, travel seminars, which I have led to India, play an important part in such consciousness. Viewing world Christianity as one world religion among many other religions gives us an entry into a whole area of working with other departments within the university, such as departments of religion, religious studies, anthropology, sociology, and so on. This is an area which needs a lot of exploration, and I, who has always kept myself within seminary, never entering a department of religion or philosophy, would expect others to work on this. Number two, a call to broaden the scope of theology. I imagine a global future in which we respond boldly to a call to broaden the scope of theology. Let me offer you a case study. You know Professor Bill Everett, who taught at Andover Newton Theological School many years ago. He was my colleague at Emory before he moved to Boston. He took an early retirement and settled in North Carolina and started doing theology in 3 different ways. First, he published a novel, Red Clay, Blood River, a best book on ethics. but fiction. Then a book of poetry, turnings, poems of transformation, and continues daily to work on wood, making tables, desks, and so on for liturgical use. One of these round convenient tables is there in our new little chapel, displaying a theology of Eucharist, day in and day out. I would consider each of his work as theological work, just like his earlier discursive books, such as God's Federal Republic. His wife Sylvia is an artist, working with tapestries and mosaics. Blessed is the theologian who has an artist as his or her spouse. You know that one. Our future depends on our willingness to recognize and promote other modes of theological reflection. Music, poetry, fiction, painting, sculptures, hymns, movies, and other forms of art and artistic performances are not merely resources for theological reflection. They are theological reflections themselves. To cite one example, music as theology is a growing idea among theologians, and we can name theologians such as Don Saliers, Emil Heaney, Philip Stoltzfus, and Lisa Hess, whose book on music as a learning theology, which has been, you have written a cover, blurb for that, among many musical theologians. Interestingly, Andrew Shenton, among us, has edited a book on Oliver Messiaen as a theologian. You know, interestingly, it is available at the music library, not in the theology library. We see its places in the music library. But this is a book about that great musician as a theologian. Carl Dow, Brian Wren, are some of those theologians who do hymnic theology. Other forms of art are yet to be explored in full. And there are some among us they are exploring, including Courtney here. They are attempting to do. This is an urgent need today. While there are thousands of theologians and hundreds of theological schools, there is still a lot of bad theology going around in our community and in our society. How is it that we have not made inroads into the mind of the public? How is it that we have not, why is it that a vulgar form of theology called prosperity theology is keeping the public under bondage to a distorted view of God, of humanity, and world? How is it that our politicians can simply ignore the progress of science and almost turn scientific thinking, unscientific thinking, into a virtue? We need to find a way to make theology accessible to people. Our theology has to become more public theology. This involves a widening of the scope and mode of theology. Writing about the future of theology, David Ford, a British theologian, has this to say: for theology to do what the Bible did, as well as interpret what the Bible said, means that it should pursue creativity in expression and performance in many modes. This in turn means openness to the whole range of artistic and cultural forms and media. Thirdly, a demand to incorporate adoration with articulation. I imagine a global future in which we seriously respond to a demand to incorporate worshipful adoration with theological articulation. We generally say theology is speech about God. Disagreeing with this view, Miroslav Volf has this to say: religious studies is a second order of discourse and therefore has its object of study, among other things, speech about God. Theology is a first order discourse, therefore has God and God's relation to the world as its object of study. Then he says, a God who is not an item of this world, whom we cannot therefore study only, we can study only indirectly through the language used about God. Indeed, properly understood theology does not only study God, its goal is to promote love of God. Wolf's argument here is a little muddled up, lacking clarity, but the point is well taken. God cannot be caged in concepts and language about God. Adoration is that which breaks the cage and helps us to talk about God as God. Did not Karl Barth say that the proper mode of theology is praying the prayer, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. The worship life of a theological school is a fundamental part of the task of doing theology. Most of the theologians we know do live with worshipful adoration of God. Yet it is not explicitly incorporated into their teaching of theology. Just like the way the chapel and theology school are two separate buildings. These need to be integrated in our teaching. Perhaps that is what Mary Elizabeth Moore means by teaching from the heart. When she quotes Whitehead and writes, education by nature, religious. It calls forth the art of revering, adoring. We do need to create an atmosphere of worshipful adoration in our classrooms while we engage and struggle with the concept of God. There is one problem though. Adoration of God has all along been attached to a view of God as personal and agential. The more we do theology, the more non-personal God becomes. Rightly so. This means we need to find ways to adore God without crass personal categories, while creating other categories of poetic imagination, and to let them serve as heuristic devices. Number 4, a plea to integrate reflection with action. I imagine a global future in which our theology and theological education respond creatively to a plea to integrate theological reflection with socio-political action. I take my hats off to Pamela Lightsey and my student Colin Cushman, who have been involved in the protest against racial injustice in Ferguson during the last few weeks. I had the privilege of having Colin in my class on the theology of mission. And I asked him to give his testimony in class. He witnessed to a creative integration of reflection and action in his theology and life through this involvement. Since the arrival of definition of theology as critical reflection on praxis by Gustavo Gutierrez, we have been awakened through such integration of action and reflection. Yet we need to find ways in the future to fully materialize this integrative process. What does it mean and how do we do it? These are questions we have to address. Rebecca Chart writes, education may well be about what we do as well as what we say. If theological education is about merely the ordered learning of cognitive ideas, then finding the right curriculum will solve all the current problems in theological education. But if knowing God is as much a matter of relationships as it is a mastery of corrective ideas, new relationships of imagination, of justice, of dialogue must be formed in the midst of a pluralistic world. And new forms of relating, teaching, community building will have to be developed. That would involve a lot more change in the way we do things. To conclude, let me highlight the importance of community. Community of accommodation and community of conversation. Let me use 3 margas from the Hindu tradition. The Hindu tradition has 3 ways, 3 options to reach God. One is called Jnana Marga, the way of wisdom or knowledge. The second one is Bhakti Marga, which is a way of devotion or attachment to God. Third one, Karma Marga, a way of action. And these are the 3 paths, Jnana Marga, Bhakti Marga, and Karma Marga. I think we have 3 types of theologians. Theologians who follow the Jnana Marga, the way of knowledge. Theologians who follow Bhakti Marga, of devotion. Theologians who engage theology as Karma Marga, as action. Theologians of knowledge, theologians of devotion, and theologians of action. Each of us chooses to be one of these, or combinations of these, based on our own history, our temperament, our gifts, our socio-cultural settings, and our community's needs. We cannot be everything, so we choose to be one, or 1 and 2, or 1 and 3. Of course, when we choose one, we cannot neglect the other 2. But our heart seems to be attached to one. To put it in another way, we are philosophical theologians, doxological theologians, and praxeological theologians. We are all here in this school and in most theological schools. This means then our future will be a flourishing one if we continue to create communities of accommodation where everyone is welcomed and supported, and communities of conversation where we challenge one another and learn from one another. This, of course, involves a complete restructuring of theological education that gives room for such diversity and such wide conversation. Such a community of conversation is not something we wait for somewhere in the distant future. Such a global future has already begun. We see the emergence of it in our own schools, in our own seminaries. I am gladdened and encouraged in my journey by witnessing such emergence as I bring to a close my career as a teacher in MDU classroom. I almost feel like singing a couple of lines from the hymn of Simeon, which I have sung as a young boy during the evensong every evening in my village church. The song, the chant goes like this. Lord, now let the servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Thank you.
Questions and comments, which is very gracious of him, and given the tenor of his talk, I might also say contributions of other sort to his lecture.
I have a question. You said that Bill Everett retired to write a novel, write poetry, and work with wood. What are you going to do?
I'm going to do a lot of preaching in my mother tongue. That's one. I'm going to have chicken in my home. That's one part. I have been drawing and painting in my younger days, and I had left that. Now I want to begin again. So I've got everything ready now for starting painting. And I have one large project called Systematic Theology from Tamil Perspective. It will be either one volume or several volumes, who knows. I plan to write that. I have started it already. I was originally thinking of writing in Tamil so that my Tamil students can read that. But then I realized with Bob Nembel's help and many conversations we have had on this, to write it in English. Because the Tamil population is a very small population. So if everybody needs to be helped with this kind of perspective, better to do it in English. Because even outside my state, nobody can read Tamil in India. So that's a long time project I have as a retired person. So these are, you never know, I may come up with other things. Perhaps write more songs, why not? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. I wonder if I could just pick up on one word that you used a couple of times, but maybe you could tie in so many pieces, including the novels and poems and hymns and even your song at the end. I was fortunate enough to take Gordon Kaufman's final course, and the mantra he chanted over and over there was creativity. So I wonder if, in all of these different facets, from ministerial theology to public theology, any kind of theology, to think about creativity, even as being created in the image of the Creator, in some senses to be creative. So if you could speak about how the idea of creativity.
Yeah, I think Kaufman's project was to start with, where do you locate God? Talk about God, we do. Where do we really locate that? In a person, or so those questions he faced, and finally, step by step, we moved towards the idea of creativity itself as God was his final two books, which are different from the invasive mystery, where there was much more Trinitarian view of God. Actually, I told him at the end of that book, Gordon, I can worship the God you talk about. Because earlier God was always a problem, which he was trying to solve. That book was kind of a wonderful, inspiring book. And then came creativity, which what I refer to today as moved to a non-personal, non-agential reality called God. So I have been highly inspired by his work all along. But at that step, I have to come back and say, how do I fit adoration in it? Because the God concept, the very idea, has adoration built into it. Then we are not defining God if we are not adding adoration to it. So with the idea of God as creativity, how do I adore that creativity? Can we find new language? You know, what language shall I borrow is the title, one of the titles of Brian Gray's book. So we have to find a new language by which we can keep the adoration of that reality, which is creativity, as he defines. So this is going to have serious implications on how we order our worship life, order our liturgy. A lot going on there. There's a lot to be done. Yes.
As you know, I'm very enthusiastic about your idea of global theology, and I think that there are a lot of people in our generation who are. Do you find that the younger people are enthusiastic about this? Or are we going to go in for a new period of balkanization of indigenous theologies?
Even you're talking about the kind of project in which we do common perspective? No, that's not what
In which all theologians have a global perspective,
yeah.
instead of a project in which Indian theologians do Indian theology, African theologians do African.
Yeah. I mean, you see, when I started my career as a theological teacher, the word was contextualization.
Yes.
Okay? So I was telling my students, it's not enough to read Tilak and Bhatt. You should read Shankara, you should read Ramanuja, you should read Christian theologians in India. I read that. But one of my essays most recently had the title, it was a book on contextualization of theological education. The title of my essay was, Local plus Global is equal to contextual. So it's not global in the sense of we're talking about some big thing big, but local, which is always aware of its place within the globe. I mean, there's no way we can talk about today local without some connection to global. That's one. The second is, I'm hoping there is a time when every theologian who does strictly contextual theology, maybe sitting here and addressing the students in the philosophy department, would also ask, what do my colleagues in Japan do? How do they deal with this? Or my colleagues in India? So if we don't ask that question and allow ourselves to be informed in some form or other, then we are in parochial, balkanized theologies. But we do need contextual. I think the word contextual has become different now. It is local plus global is equal to contextual. If we operate with that formula, we will still do highly contextual theology, but it's always aware of its global connections. Because what we're trying to do is to connect people, create a world of connections. So how does our theology help? That would be an issue. Yes, Courtney.
You were talking about there's an abundance of bad theology in the world. And I wonder if you forms of theology that are aesthetic, and whether you have criteria, or how do you evaluate what is good theology when it comes in aesthetic forms?
That's a big question. You know, when I teach my course on Christology, I end that class with a set of criteria for evaluating whether my image of Christ is helpful, appropriate, useful. So one can, on the basis of the history of theology and the resources that we use for theology, can come up with a set of questions to ask ourselves. These would be questions, not solid measuring rods. What are the questions we need to ask now? One, does this make sense to somebody who reads it? Or somebody who sees it? Somebody who hears it? A simple question which theologians very often have forgotten to ask. Number two, what does this do to people? Which sounds a big question. But you know, that's a question we need to ask. We cannot answer all the time in the same way. It may differ. You know, my experience in Harvard, we had a seminar on Paul Tillich for doctoral seminar. It was fun to be in. And that's the time also my ideas about Tillich began to change. Now, there was a student in that colloquium who would kind of irritatingly ask every time, what does this mean for a Mexican farmer? A farmer in Mexico? Tillich? New being in Jesus as the Christ? What? So that question we thought was irritating question, and also said, no, we are trying to connect two things which we are not supposed to connect that way. There are many steps in the middle. So, but there is something beautiful about that question. If I am the person working with farmers in Mexico, when I read Tillich, I have to ask, what does this mean? I cannot ask Tillich to do that, I have to do it. If I find Tillich helpful. So, there are a set of questions. One of the questions I usually ask myself, does this help the worshipful adoration of the divine? Or does it remove people from it? Some people may have to be removed from the kind of worshipful devotion they have. That is there too. But does this enhance the adoration of God? So one can come up with a set of questions which will be changing over time too. And changing in terms of what context you are in. So you may ask a different set of questions. I may ask a different question. In a city in India, I may ask one set of questions. In the small village in India, I may ask a different set of questions to evaluate my theology. So I think that's kind of that again is a conversation. Questions create conversation. Because that's often criteria look like solid things by which we judge. No, it's a process of talking it over. That's how I would see it.
Anyone else? Want to ask the last question at the last lecture?
Please.
Thank you. I like very much your beginning with Paul Tillich and what you said about him. And I'm wondering if I would be right in discerning a continuing Tillichian influence when you specify the three types of theology: philosophical theology, devotion, and action. Might they not be correlated with volume 1 and volume 2 and volume 3?
Yeah. With all my disagreements with Tillich today, there's so much Tillich in me. That's why I started in the year Tillich died. I started my theology. I mean, Tillich has had a profound influence on my theological thinking. I think my major complaint is that he still was within the New Orthodox framework. And he was moving out of that towards the end when he wrote about world religions and about Buddhist dialogue. He was a different Tillich. And even in the book, he is a different Tillich in each volume. You know, the first volume is so highly philosophical and dealing with the rationality and all things like that. The second volume gets a little more existential questions and struggles of life. And the third one comes with history and the spirit at work in the world. And at least I learned from him that you don't have to stick to your theology. You can keep changing it. So your third volume doesn't have to completely match with the first one. Why? Things change and our context change. So I think that also one maybe a lesson from Tillich. Make sure that the fourth volume is very different from the first volume. If you have grown at all, if you have experienced more in life at all. I think these were challenges that came to me. It has been a fun journey going there. But and also, you know, the shaking of foundations by Tillich had a profound influence on me. That you can do this systematic theology on one side and preach such powerful sermons, which are actually theological statements, done in a different way. You know, his preaching on accept the fact that you are accepted. What excellent theological statement on soteriology, but done in preaching. So I think there's so much there in that sense I learned from him. And I'm one of those persons who have been so blessed to have wonderful teachers along the way. Not simply Kaufman and Tillich. There were so many others who taught me. I had a professor I was the only student in my THM program in his class. So we switched roles. So I taught the course and he sat and listened to me. And because I said, I'm going to become a theological teacher, a better teacher, so why don't I try teaching? So actually I taught the whole course. And every class I'll come prepared to teach the course and he will sit there. Listen to me, of course, all his colleagues that this was a cheap way out. but I loved it, I enjoyed it, I learned so much from that class. You know, much more than any other class. So I think I've been blessed with teachers everywhere I go. And then, of course, talk about students. They teach you a lot. They can come up with some nasty questions that makes you think. Thanks to everyone. Thank you.